Where should I undress?
The giant mail-order bride asked as she looked down at the lonely rancher in his dark brown coat and wide-brimmed hat, this bearded stranger who was now her husband, and felt terror and hope war inside her chest. They'd been married less than an hour ago in his dusty parlor, and now they stood alone on this vast golden prairie, the wind pulling at her skirts, the sun setting behind distant mountains. And she was asking him where a woman too big for the world should become vulnerable. 7 years he'd been alone. 7 years since he'd buried his wife, Prudence, and baby Samuel on the hill behind his ranch. 7 years of loneliness so crushing it had turned him hollow, a ghost wearing a man's coat and hat. He'd sent for a mail-order bride in desperation, never believing anyone would come, never believing he deserved a second chance at love. But she came. God help him. She actually came. "Where should I undress?" the giant mail-order bride asked again, her voice carrying across the empty prairie, and he could hear everything she wasn't saying. All the fear, all the shame, all the years of being told she was too much, too tall, too strong, too different to ever be wanted as a woman. The lonely rancher felt his throat tighten because he understood that fear. He understood what it meant to be broken, to be wrong, to be the person everyone whispered about in town. The cursed widower, they called him, the man who couldn't save his own family. He'd lived 7 years as a ghost, and now this towering woman in her cream-colored dress was asking him where she should reveal herself, asking if he could bear to see all of her. His hands trembled inside his coat, the wind tugged at his hat, and he realized this moment, right here on this golden prairie under the setting sun, was the moment that would define everything. She was testing him, testing whether he was like every other man who'd mocked her, rejected her, made her feel like a freak instead of the miracle she was. "Where should I undress?" Her voice broke on the question, and the lonely rancher saw tears gathering in her eyes, saw the way her strong hands shook at her sides, saw how this giant mail-order bride who could probably lift him off the ground was trembling like a frightened bird. Something cracked open inside his chest, something that had been frozen for 7 years. He stepped closer, having to tilt his head back to meet her eyes, this bearded rancher in his dusty coat, looking up at this statuesque goddess in cream, and his voice came out raw with emotion he'd forgotten he could feel. "Slowly," he whispered, and watched her eyes widen with uncertainty, with fear, with desperate hope. "Right in front of me." The giant mail-order bride's breath caught. Out here on the open prairie where anyone could see, where the wind carried secrets, where the setting sun painted everything gold, he wanted her to undress here? Was this cruelty, or was this something her heart was afraid to believe? The lonely rancher took another step closer, close enough that she could see tears tracking through the dust on his bearded face. "I want to remember this moment," he said, his voice breaking like his heart was breaking, like he was breaking open after 7 years of being dead inside. "I want to remember the exact second my life started again." Tempe's knees nearly buckled, not her body, not her shame. He wanted to remember her trust, her courage. The moment she chose to believe that maybe, just maybe, one man in this cruel world could see past her height and her strength to the woman underneath who'd spent 28 years aching to be wanted. Her fingers moved to the top button of her cream-colored dress. They shook so badly she could barely grip the small pearl fastening. The wind howled across the prairie, whipping her skirts around her legs, pulling strands of blonde hair loose from her careful bun. The sun was sinking fast now, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson, and she thought about how she'd gotten here, how a Chicago factory girl who broke chairs and frightened children had ended up on a Texas prairie about to undress in front of a bearded stranger who called himself her husband. But he wasn't looking at her body. He was looking at her face, at her eyes, at the tears spilling down her cheeks, and his own face was wet too, his dark beard damp with tears he wasn't trying to hide. "I'm scared," she whispered, the words torn away by the wind. "So am I," he said back, and somehow that made all the difference. The first button came free, then the second. The lonely rancher didn't move, didn't reach for her, just stood there with his hat in his hands now, watching her face like she was something precious he was afraid might shatter. The giant mail-order bride kept going, button after button, her cream-colored dress falling open to reveal the simple cotton undergarments beneath, and with each button she felt something inside her chest loosening too, some terrible knot of shame and fear that had been tied there since she was tall enough to realize she'd never be like other girls. The dress slipped from her shoulders and pooled at her feet on the dusty prairie ground. She stood there in her undergarments, this towering woman who'd been called a giant and a freak and worse, stood there trembling in the golden light while the lonely rancher looked at her with something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not lust, not disgust, something else entirely, something that looked like wonder, mixed with grief, mixed with a desperate kind of gratitude that made her want to weep. "You're beautiful," Zeke said, and his voice cracked on the words. "Temperance, you're the most beautiful thing I've seen in 7 years." She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was lying, that men like him didn't mean words like that when they said them to women like her. But the way he was looking at her, up at her, always up because even barefoot she'd tower over him, stopped the protests in her throat. He took off his brown coat, moved toward her slowly like she was a wild horse that might bolt, and draped it around her shoulders. It smelled like leather and wood smoke and something uniquely him, and it was warm from his body heat. "That's enough," he said quietly. "That's all I needed to see." "What?" Tempe's voice came out confused, shaky. "But I needed to see if you'd trust me," Zeke said, and now he was close enough that she could see the exact color of his eyes, deep brown like rich earth, red-rimmed from tears. "I needed to see if you believed I was different from all those other men who hurt you. I needed—" His voice broke completely. "I needed to know this was real, that you were real. That I wasn't still dead inside just dreaming of being alive again." The giant mail-order bride stared down at this bearded rancher who'd asked her to undress and then covered her up again, who'd looked at her with reverence instead of hunger, who was crying on a Texas prairie because she'd trusted him enough to be vulnerable. And something inside her chest that had been locked up tight for 28 years suddenly burst open like a dam breaking. She dropped to her knees in the dust, dropped down so she was eye level with him for the first time since they'd met, and she grabbed his face in her large hands and kissed him hard and desperate and grateful, tasting salt from both their tears, feeling his beard rough against her skin, feeling his hands come up to grip her arms like he was drowning and she was solid ground. When they finally broke apart, both gasping, Zeke pressed his forehead to hers. "I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret coming here," he whispered. "I swear it, Tempe. I swear on Prudence's grave and Samuel's memory. Don't," she said, pressing her fingers to his lips. "Don't swear on the dead. Swear on the living. Swear on us." He nodded, his hat falling completely off now, tumbling away in the wind. "On us, then. On whatever we're going to build here." They stayed like that for a long moment, kneeling in the dust while the sun finished setting and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Then Zeke stood and helped her up, helped her back into her dress, his fingers careful and respectful on each button he'd watched her undo. When she was covered again, he took her hand, his small and calloused, hers large and work-roughened, and led her toward the ranch house. "There's something I need to show you," he said. "Before we go inside as husband and wife, there's something you need to see." Tempe followed, still wearing his coat over her shoulders, still tasting his kiss on her lips, still trying to understand what had just happened on that prairie. He led her past the barn where she could hear horses moving in their stalls, past the chicken coop where hens were, settling for the night, up a small hill behind the house where 2 wooden crosses stood stark against the twilight sky. "Prudence Thornwell, beloved wife," read one. "Baby Samuel, gone too soon," read the other. Zeke stood before the grave, still holding Tempe's hand, and his voice when he spoke was steady despite the tears still tracking down his face. "Prudence was small," he said quietly. "Tiny thing, barely came up to my shoulder. Everyone said we looked right together, him being average-sized and her being so petite. We looked like we fit." He paused, swallowed hard. "But looking right didn't save her, didn't save our son. She died screaming my name, begging me to help her, and I couldn't do a damn thing except hold her hand and watch her slip away." Tempe squeezed his hand tighter, said nothing, just listened. "I blamed myself for 7 years, Zeke continued. "Thought maybe if I'd been bigger, stronger, different somehow, I could have saved them. Town blamed me too, said I was cursed, said death followed me, said any woman fool enough to marry me would end up right here next to Prudence." He turned to look up at Tempe, and his eyes were fierce now, burning with something that might have been anger or might have been determination. "But you know what I realized yesterday when you stepped off that stage?" "What?" she whispered. "That I'd been looking for the wrong thing. Everyone expected me to find another tiny woman, another Prudence copy who'd fit in my arms easy and look right standing next to me. But God sent me you instead. Sent me someone too big for the world, someone strong enough to survive what this land throws at you, someone who—" His voice cracked again. Someone who could carry me when I'm too weak to stand, just like I'll hold you when you need holding. We don't look right together, Tempe. But maybe that's exactly why we'll survive. The giant mail-order bride felt something break open inside her chest again, something even bigger than before. She pulled Zeke into her arms, pulled him against her chest, and held him while he finally let himself grieve properly. 7 years of held-back tears came pouring out, soaking into her dress, his whole body shaking with sobs he'd been too dead inside to cry until now. "I've got you," Tempe whispered, running her large hands through his dark hair, holding this broken rancher like he was something precious. "I've got you, Zeke, and I'm strong enough to hold you for as long as you need." They stayed like that on the hill above the graves, while full dark settled over Texas and the stars came out bright and fierce overhead. And when Zeke finally pulled back, wiping his face with his sleeve, he looked lighter somehow, less haunted, more alive. "Come on," he said, taking her hand again. "Let me show you your home." The ranch house was bigger than Tempe expected, built solid from good timber with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Zeke lit lanterns as they entered, golden light spilling across polished wood floors and simple furniture that looked handmade and cared for. The main room had a stone fireplace, a worn leather sofa, shelves lined with books, and a dining table with chairs that looked, she noticed with a pang, delicate. Too delicate for someone her size. "I know what you're thinking," Zeke said, watching her eye the furniture. "And you're wrong." He walked to the kitchen, gestured for her to follow. In the corner sat a chair unlike any she'd ever seen. Massive, beautiful, built from oak with arms carved in the shape of prairie flowers. It looked like a throne fit for a queen, sturdy enough to hold someone twice her size. "I built it last night," Zeke said quietly, "after we talked on the porch. After you told me about breaking that chair in Chicago, about always being too big for everything. I went to my workshop and I built you this, built it strong enough that you'd never have to worry, never have to hold yourself tense, wondering if the wood will crack under you." Temp's vision blurred with fresh tears. She walked to the chair, ran her fingers over the smooth wood, the careful carvings, the joints reinforced with metal brackets. This wasn't something thrown together quick. This was craftsmanship. This was hours of work through the night. This was love in the shape of furniture. "Sit," Zeke said. "Please, I need to know I got the measurements right." She sat. The chair held. She fit. And for the first time in her adult life, Temperance Broadwick sat in a chair without fear, without tension, without that terrible waiting for the crack and splinter that always came. She leaned back. The chair stayed solid. She shifted her weight. Nothing broke. "It's perfect," she whispered. "You're perfect," Zeke said back, and the way he said it made her believe him just a little bit. He showed her the rest of the house, the kitchen with its cast-iron stove and hand pump for water, the pantry stocked with supplies, the parlor where they'd been married just hours ago. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms. He'd clearly been sleeping in the smallest one, his few possessions scattered there. The largest bedroom, the master bedroom, stood empty except for a bed frame that looked like it had been built for giants. "I made that too," Zeke admitted, looking embarrassed. "Regular beds are what, 6 feet? I built this one 7 feet long and wide enough for both of us. Figured we'd both need room to spread out and you'd need room to not hang off the end." Tempe stared at the bed, at this man who'd spent his nights building her furniture instead of sleeping, who'd thought about her comfort before his own desire, who'd prepared his home for her like she was someone worth preparing for. In Chicago, she'd slept on a cot too small, her feet hanging off the edge, waking up every morning with her back aching. The mail-order agency had told her to expect rough conditions, had warned her that frontier wives made do with whatever their husbands provided. But Zeke hadn't made her make do. He'd built her a world where she could fit. "Why?" she asked, her voice small despite her size. "Why would you do all this for someone you'd never met?" Zeke turned to look at her, and in the lamplight she could see every line of grief and loneliness etched into his face. "Because I know what it feels like to not fit," he said simply. "I know what it's like to be the wrong shape for the world you're living in. And I thought," he paused, struggling with words, "I thought maybe if I built you a place where you fit, maybe you'd stay. Maybe you wouldn't get back on that stage and leave me here alone again." "You thought I'd leave. Why wouldn't you?" Zeke's voice went rough. "You could take one look at this cursed widower, this broken-down rancher who can barely smile, this man the whole town whispers about, and decide you made a mistake. You could leave tomorrow and no one would blame you." Tempe crossed the room in 3 long strides, closing the distance between them. She put her hands on his shoulders, and even though she was looking down at him, even though she towered over him by nearly a foot, she'd never felt more equal to another person in her life. "I'm not leaving," she said firmly. "Not tomorrow, not ever. You hear me, Ezekiel Thornwell? You're stuck with me now. Even though the town thinks I'm cursed? Especially because of that." Tempe's voice went fierce. "You know what the factory foreman told me when I left Chicago? He said I should be grateful anyone wanted me at all, said I should accept whatever treatment I got because beggars can't be choosers, said a woman my size was lucky to get scraps. That bastard, but you didn't give me scraps," Tempe continued, squeezing his shoulders. "You gave me chairs and beds built for my body. You gave me respect and tears and truth. You brought me to your wife's grave and trusted me with your grief. You asked me to undress and then covered me up again because you wanted my trust more than my body." Her voice cracked. "Do you have any idea how rare that is? Do you know what it means to me?" Zeke's hands came up to cover hers, his small fingers wrapping around her larger ones. "I think I'm starting to." They stood like that for a moment, this mismatched couple in an empty bedroom, learning the shape of each other's hands. Then Zeke cleared his throat, looking suddenly nervous. "There's one more thing," he said. "One more thing I need to tell you before we spend our first night as husband and wife." Tempe's stomach tightened. Here it was. The catch. The thing he'd been hiding. Every good thing in her life had come with a catch. "My foreman," Zeke said slowly. "Sterling Cade. He's worked this ranch for 10 years, was here when Prudence died, helped me through the worst of the grief. But yesterday, when you arrived," he paused, jaw working, "I saw how he looked at you, and it wasn't good, Tempe. It was cruel. Like you were something that didn't belong here. I'm used to people looking at me like that. You shouldn't have to be." Zeke's voice went hard. "And I won't let it happen on my ranch. I already told Sterling this morning that if he can't treat you with respect, he can find work elsewhere." "You'd fire him? For me?" "In a heartbeat." Zeke met her eyes, his expression fierce despite having to tilt his head back to do it. "You're my wife now. That means you come first. Before old friendships, before convenience, before anything. Sterling thinks I'm making a mistake, thinks you're—" He stopped, clearly not wanting to repeat whatever Sterling had said. "Thinks I'm what?" Tempe pressed. "A freak? A monster? Too big to be a proper wife?" "Something like that." Zeke's hands tightened on hers. "But he's wrong. And I'll keep telling him he's wrong until either he believes it or he leaves. Your choice which one happens." Tempe felt her throat close up with emotion. In Chicago, no one had ever defended her. Not when the foreman made crude jokes, not when the other workers tripped her for entertainment, not when children threw stones and called her giant and freak and worse. She'd learned to defend herself, to keep her head down, to make herself as small as possible despite her size. But this bearded rancher was offering her something different: protection, partnership, a place where she wouldn't have to shrink herself to survive. "What do you need from me?" she asked quietly. "To make this work, to be the wife you need." Zeke shook his head. "Wrong question, Tempe. The question is, what do you need from me? Because I'll give you anything except loneliness. We've both had enough of that to last 10 lifetimes. Outside, the prairie wind howled against the house. Inside, 2 broken people stood in lamplight, learning how to be whole together. And when Zeke finally led Tempe down to the kitchen, heated up leftover stew, and watched her sit in the chair he'd built without fear of it breaking, when he saw the way her whole body relaxed, the way years of tension melted from her shoulders, he knew he'd made the right choice sending for a mail-order bride. He just hadn't expected to fall in love with her this fast. They ate in comfortable silence, and afterward, Tempe insisted on washing the dishes despite Zeke's protests. She stood at the hand pump, scrubbing plates in the basin, and he dried them with a cloth, and it felt domestic and normal, and right in a way nothing had felt right for 7 years. "Tell me about your first day here," Tempe said as she handed him a clean plate. "Yesterday, when I stepped off that stage, what were you thinking?" Zeke dried the plate carefully, considering his words. "Honest truth? Always? I was thinking you were the most magnificent thing I'd ever seen," he said quietly. "And I was terrified you'd take one look at me and get right back on that stage." Tempe turned from the basin to stare at him, soapy water dripping from her hands. "You thought I was magnificent?" "Still do." Zeke met her eyes, his expression serious. "You stepped off that stage like a queen arriving in her kingdom, head held high despite everyone staring. You didn't shrink yourself down, didn't apologize for your size. You just stood there in the dust and the sunlight, and you were—" He struggled for the right word. "Regal. That's what you were. Regal. The whole town was whispering about me. Let them whisper." Zeke set the dried plate on the counter. "They whispered about me for 7 years, called me cursed, called me broken, crossed the street to avoid me. You know what I learned? People who whisper don't matter. Only the ones brave enough to speak truth to your face matter. And you, Temperance Thornwell, spoke truth to my face from the moment you arrived." They finished the dishes together, this strange rhythm of her washing and him drying, and when the last plate was stacked away, Zeke led her back upstairs to the master bedroom. The lamp he'd left burning cast dancing shadows on the walls. The massive bed he'd built dominated the room, piled with quilts his mother had made years ago, pillows that smelled like fresh lavender. "I'll sleep in the other room tonight if you want," Zeke said quietly, standing in the doorway like he was afraid to enter. "We're married legal, but that doesn't mean—" "I won't push you, Tempe. We can take this slow as you need." Tempe looked at this man who'd built her furniture, who'd cried on her shoulder, who'd asked her to undress and then covered her up again, because her trust mattered more than his desire. She looked at the bed he'd built big enough for her body, at the care he'd taken with every detail, at the way he was giving her choice even now when most men would have taken what they considered theirs by right. "Stay," she said simply. "Please. I've been alone long enough. I think we both have." Something in Zeke's face cracked open, relief mixed with joy, mixed with disbelief. He nodded, unable to speak, and they prepared for bed with the awkwardness of strangers, learning to be intimate. Tempe changed into her nightgown behind a privacy screen Zeke had thoughtfully placed in the corner. He changed into his nightshirt facing the wall, and when they finally climbed into that massive bed, lying on opposite sides with a canyon of space between them, they both stared at the ceiling in the darkness. "Zeke?" Tempe's voice was small in the night. "Yeah? Would you hold me? Just hold me. I haven't been held since my mother died when I was 12, and I'm tired of being strong all the time." She heard him move, felt the mattress shift, and then his arms were wrapping around her from behind. His body was smaller than hers, but he held her like she was precious, like she was breakable despite her strength, his face pressed between her shoulder blades, his breath warm. Through her nightgown. "I've got you," he whispered, echoing her words from earlier. "I've got you, Tempe." She turned in his arms so they were face to face in the darkness, her large hands finding his bearded face, his smaller hands gripping her waist. And when they kissed this time, it wasn't desperate or grateful. It was slow, learning. Two people discovering what it meant to be wanted exactly as they were. "Thank you," Tempe whispered against his lips. "For what?" "For seeing me, really seeing me. Not my height or my strength or my size, just me." Zeke pulled her closer, and even though she was bigger than him, even though she could lift him off the ground without effort, in this moment they fit together perfectly. "That's all I've ever wanted too," he said quietly. "Someone to see past the grief and the curse and the dead man I've been. Someone to see Zeke. Just Zeke." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other in the bed he'd built, in the house that was now theirs. While outside, the Texas wind sang across the prairie and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient dance. Morning came with sunlight streaming through the windows and the sound of roosters crowing. Tempe woke first, disoriented, then remembered. She was married. This was her home. The man sleeping beside her with his dark hair, mussed and his beard pressed against her shoulder was her husband. She lay there watching him sleep, this lonely rancher who'd given her everything she'd ever dreamed of, and felt something dangerous blooming in her chest. Love. Real love. Not gratitude or relief or desperation. Actual love for this complicated man who built furniture in the night and cried at his wife's grave and looked at her like she hung the moon. Zeke's eyes opened slowly, found hers, and he smiled. A real smile. The first one she'd seen from him that reached all the way to his eyes. "Morning, wife," he said, voice rough with sleep. "Morning, husband," she said back, testing the words on her tongue. They lay there grinning at each other like fools until the sound of boots on the porch broke the moment. Heavy footsteps, angry footsteps, then a fist pounding on the door. "Boss!" Sterling Cade's voice rang out, sharp with something that sounded like urgency or rage or both. "Boss, you need to get out here now!" Zeke's smile vanished. He climbed out of bed, pulled on his pants and boots, grabbed his shirt. Tempe started to rise, but he held up a hand. "Stay here," he said quietly. "Let me handle Sterling." "No," Tempe was already out of bed, already pulling on her dress from yesterday. I'm your wife. We handle things together or not at all. She saw pride flash across Zeke's face, saw him nod. They went downstairs together, and when Zeke opened the door, Sterling Cade stood there with 3 other ranch hands behind him. Sterling was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, with cold eyes and a mouth set in a permanent sneer. Those cold eyes swept over Tempe, and the disgust in them was unmistakable. "We got a problem," Sterling said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Herd broke through the north fence overnight. Cattle scattered halfway to the next county. Gonna take all day to round them up, maybe longer." He paused, his gaze sliding to Tempe again. "Unless your new wife scared them off with her size." The other ranch hands shifted uncomfortably. Zeke's jaw went tight. "That's enough," Zeke said quietly, but there was steel underneath. "You got something to say about my wife, Sterling. You say it respectful or you don't say it at all." "Respectful?" Sterling laughed, harsh and ugly. "Boss, you brought a freak show to the ranch and you want me to be respectful. Look at her. She's bigger than half the men here. What's next? You gonna have her working the herd?" "If she wants to, yes." Zeke stepped forward, putting himself between Sterling and Tempe. "And you're gonna treat her like you'd treat any rancher's wife. With respect. With courtesy. Or you're gonna find yourself looking for new work." Sterling's face went red. "You'd fire me? After 10 years? For her?" "In a heartbeat." The 2 men stared at each other, tension crackling like lightning between them. Then Tempe stepped around Zeke, moved past him despite his protest, and stood facing Sterling Cade. She had to look down at him. Even this big, cruel foreman was shorter than her, and when she spoke, her voice was calm and clear. "You're right," she said simply. "I'm bigger than half the men here. Stronger too, probably. And you know what that means, Mr. Cade? It means I can help round up those cattle. It means I can work alongside your men and probably outwork some of them. It means I'm not some delicate thing that needs protecting." Sterling's sneer deepened. "You think you can work cattle? You think—" "I think you're scared," Tempe interrupted, and her voice went soft. "I think you're scared because everything you thought you knew about this ranch just changed. I think you're scared because Zeke is different now. He's alive again instead of dead inside. And you preferred him dead because dead men don't challenge you. And I think you're scared because a woman who doesn't fit your idea of what women should be threatens everything you believe about the world." The other ranch hands were staring now, riveted. Sterling looked like he'd been slapped. "But here's the truth, Mr. Cade," Tempe continued. "I'm not going anywhere. This is my home now. Zeke is my husband. And you can either accept that and we can all work together to make this ranch prosper, or you can let your fear and your cruelty eat you alive until there's nothing left but bitterness." She paused. "Your choice." For a long moment, Sterling just stood there, his face working through a dozen emotions. Then he spat in the dust at her feet and turned to Zeke. "You're making a mistake, boss. Mark my words. That thing you married is going to bring you nothing but trouble." He stalked off toward the barn, the other ranch hands following with uncertain glances back at Tempe and Zeke. When they were gone, Zeke turned to his wife with something like awe on his face. "That was... you were... too much?" Tempe asked quietly, suddenly uncertain. "I shouldn't have spoken like that. I should have let you handle it." "Too much?" Zeke grabbed her hands, pulled her down so he could kiss her hard and quick. "Tempe, that was perfect. That was... God, that was the most magnificent thing I've ever seen." She felt herself flush with pleasure, with pride, with the strange new sensation of being praised instead of criticized for speaking her mind. But the warm moment was broken by shouts from the direction of the barn. Angry shouts, men arguing, and then Sterling's voice rising above them all. "If you don't like it, leave. Any man who wants to work for a cursed rancher and his freak wife can stay. The rest of you, there's other ranches, better ranches." Zeke's face went pale. "He's trying to turn the men against me. If they leave, if I lose my ranch hands, then we work twice as hard," Tempe said firmly. "The ones who stay are the ones worth keeping anyway." They walked to the barn together, Zeke's hand gripping hers like she was an anchor in a storm. Inside, they found chaos. Sterling stood on one side with 2 of the ranch hands, while 3 others stood uncertainly in the middle, and old Jonas, the oldest hand on the ranch, leaned against a stall watching the whole scene with sad, knowing eyes. "Make your choice, boys," Sterling was saying. "Stay and watch this ranch fall apart, or come with me to the Henderson spread. They're hiring, and they don't employ freaks." "Sterling," old Jonas spoke up, his voice gravelly but strong. "That's enough. You've said your piece. Now let the men decide without your poison in their ears." Sterling rounded on him. You're taking their side, old man? I'm taking the side of decency. Jonas pushed off from the stall, walked slowly toward Tempe and Zeke. He stopped in front of Tempe, looked up at her, way up, and then did something she never expected. He took off his hat and held it over his heart. Ma'am, he said respectfully, name's Jonas Harper. I've worked this ranch for 15 years, watched the boss bury his wife and son, watched him turn into a ghost. Yesterday, for the first time in 7 years, I heard him laugh. You did that. So you got my loyalty and you got my respect, and anyone who says different can answer to me. Tempe felt tears prick her eyes. She reached out, put her hand gently on Jonas's weathered shoulder. Thank you. One by one, the other ranch hands made their choices. 2 followed Sterling out of the barn with barely a backward glance. 3 stayed, moving to stand with Jonas. It wasn't enough men to run a ranch this size properly, but it was something. It was loyalty. It was the beginning of something new. Sterling stood in the barn doorway, his face twisted with rage and something that might have been hurt underneath. You'll regret this, Thornwell. All of you will. That woman's cursed and she'll drag you all down with her. Then we'll fall together, Zeke said quietly. Now get off my land, Sterling. You're done here. Sterling left, taking his allies with him, and the barn fell into heavy silence. Then Jonas clapped his hands together, businesslike. Well, we got cattle to round up and we're short-handed. Mrs. Thornwell, you ever worked livestock? No, sir, Tempe admitted, but I'm a fast learner, and I'm stronger than I look. You look pretty damn strong, ma'am, begging your pardon. Jonas almost smiled. Come on then, let's see what you're made of. The day that followed was the hardest physical work Tempe had ever done, and in the Chicago factory, she'd lifted crates that made grown men grunt. But chasing scattered cattle across the Texas prairie in the burning sun, learning to rope and herd and cut, working alongside men who watched her with a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect. That was something else entirely. She fell off her horse twice, got kicked by a stubborn heifer, roped a calf so enthusiastically she nearly pulled it off its feet, but she kept going, kept learning, kept working until her dress was soaked with sweat and her hands were blistered and her whole body ached. And Zeke watched her with something like worship in his eyes. By late afternoon, they'd rounded up most of the scattered herd and gotten them back into the repaired north pasture. Tempe sat on the ground by the fence, too exhausted to care about propriety, her long legs stretched out, her hair falling loose from its bun. Zeke sat beside her, their shoulders touching, both of them coated in dust and sweat. You did good today, he said quietly. I nearly killed that calf with my rope. But you didn't. He bumped her shoulder with his. You learned fast, faster than most. Jonas said you're a natural. Jonas is being kind. Jonas doesn't lie. Zeke turned to look at her profile, at the way the setting sun painted her face gold. Tempe, I need you to understand something. Today, when Sterling left, when those men chose sides, you could have stayed in the house. You could have let me handle it alone, but you stood with me. You worked beside me. You showed everyone on this ranch what kind of woman you are. What kind is that? The kind worth building a life with, Zeke said simply. The kind worth loving. Tempe turned to stare at him, her heart suddenly pounding. Loving? I know it's fast, Zeke said, his voice going rough. I know we barely know each other. But Tempe, I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stepped off that stage. And today, watching you face down Sterling, watching you work yourself near to death to help me save my herd, his voice cracked. I'm all the way in love with you now, completely, hopelessly, and I know you might not feel the same, might never feel the same. But I needed you to know. The giant mail-order bride looked at the lonely rancher who wasn't lonely anymore, at this man who'd given her chairs and beds and respect and now his heart, and she felt the last wall around her own heart crumble into dust. I love you too, she whispered. God help me, Zeke. I love you too. They kissed there in the dirt beside the cattle pen, both of them filthy and exhausted and perfectly, completely happy. And when they finally pulled apart, Zeke stood and helped her up, and they walked hand in hand back to the ranch house while the sun set behind them and painted the whole world gold. That night, after they'd washed and eaten and climbed into the bed Zeke had built, Tempe lay in her husband's arms and thought about how strange life was. 24 hours ago, she'd been standing on a train platform in Chicago, terrified and desperate, wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Now she was home. Zeke, she whispered into the darkness. Thank you for asking where I should undress. She felt him smile against her shoulder. Thank you for trusting me enough to answer. They fell asleep like that, the giant mail-order bride and the lonely rancher who wasn't lonely anymore, two broken people who'd found each other under the Texas sky and learned that sometimes the pieces that don't fit anywhere else fit perfectly together. And outside, the prairie wind sang across the land, carrying their story into the night, a story about love and acceptance and the courage it takes to trust someone with your broken pieces, a story that proved that the right person doesn't make you smaller to fit their world. They build you a bigger world where you can finally be yourself. Where are you watching this story from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. We love hearing from viewers all around the world. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss our next emotional journey. These stories of love, hope, and second chances are meant to remind us all that we're not alone in our struggles, and that somewhere out there, there's a place and a person where we finally fit. Thank you for watching, and remember, you are exactly the right size for the life you're meant to live.